Hi, everybody, and welcome to our virtual class on the music of the Renaissance. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. So in class next week, we'll review some features of medieval music via the remaining student presentations. So if you still have to present, be sure to get your notes ready, and you might review them a little bit before class begins next week. You may notice that the first paper is due in 2 weeks. You'll find details about that assignment on the OL, and I'll be making reference to that paper a little bit later in the course of our conversation today. We'll also next week be having our first listening quiz on the medieval and Renaissance playlists, so you should be studying up for those. If you have any questions, let me know. And finally, I'll be emailing more information about the first online quiz, which is going to go into effect quite soon, but I'll be sending information about that. So, now on to music of the Renaissance period. What is meant by Renaissance? So, in several disciplines like the arts and philosophy, it implies an increased awareness and appreciation for classical civilizations like those of ancient Greece and Rome. So we're talking about civilizations from our point of view that flourished more, give or take 2,000 years ago, give or take several centuries. This idea is related to the concept of humanism. Humanism is basically a way of thinking about the human condition that gives greater importance to the human being himself, herself. Now, in music, we're referring to, when we talk about the Renaissance, the 15th and the 16th centuries. That period, that term, rather, the Renaissance, applies to a somewhat earlier period in other disciplines like the visual arts. Strangely, it's only in the period that we now call the Baroque that there was a more thoroughgoing and direct attempt to recreate the power of music of ancient civilizations. The musical Renaissance period had a less direct connection to ancient music, in large part because that music was, as we've talked about before, simply not recoverable almost entirely. It was lost, especially to musicians of that period. Instead, there's some connection to the Renaissance more broadly in a few trends connected to ancient music theory, but more in the general sense of a music that seems more connected to the human experience, especially how words and music are more intimately joined together than in music of the preceding periods. So, general musical trends of the period. A lot of the activity was centered in what is now northern France and Belgium, seeded by influence from England. And this eventually led to a broadly international style of polyphonic composition throughout most of Western Europe, the so-called ars perfecta style, or perfect or perfected or completed art. The change to musical style that we now describe as the Renaissance was not revolutionary as such, but it was very much founded on developments in the ars nova and ars subtilior styles of the 14th century. Also, periods where activity was centered in what we now call France. So what was new in the Renaissance? There was an increased reliance on the intervals of thirds and sixths as quasi-stable sonorities. There was a relationship among the voices in a polyphonic texture. That relationship became, broadly speaking, more equal. The voices were of equal importance, although many structural devices such as a cantus firmus were still in use. There was a gradually closer relationship between verbal declamation and the way that melodies were composed, whether this was in a sacred or a secular context. And we should remember that in different languages, there are different ideas about how the language is declaimed. So French has a different style of declamation from Italian. Sometimes this is called a tune shape. What else is new in the Renaissance? a style that was cultivated chiefly in a relatively small region, but that spread such that one could speak of an international style of composition in Western Europe. That international style, a little bit later on, gets fragmented into national styles when we get to the 17th, 18th century, what we call the Baroque period. So a little bit of historical context in talking about the early Renaissance, and now we're talking about the 15th century. So because of the close political contact between England and France in the early 15th century, there was a great deal of cross-pollination in the arts and music among them. One of the most consequential figures in music in this period is the Englishman John Dunstable. Now, much of his music was lost, and the music of his contemporaries, in large part due to the religious and political turmoil of subsequent centuries in England. A little bit more on that later. But in any case, Dunstable and some of his contemporaries in England were very influential in things happening in France. So a couple key features of this English style. There was, as we've talked about in terms of broad trends of music of the Renaissance, an increased focus on the third, and its inversion, the sixth, as something approaching a consonance or a stable sonority, basically as we consider those sonorities today in most of our own musical contexts. Now, this still wasn't a completely stable sound for composers of the period. For example, one wouldn't find this commonly at the end of a piece of music, at least not in this period of the 15th century. This changes a little bit later in the Renaissance. Also, a key feature of this English style was a more familiar, from our point of view, sense of text declamation in music. And a good example of this is a rather famous piece by John Dunstable, Quam Pulchra Es. So I'd like you to take a moment right now and listen to that piece from the Naxos playlist. You can pause the video, take a couple of minutes and listen, and then come back. Many of the sounds and the ways that the voices interact with one another in this piece, this motet, Quam Pulchra Es, can be traced to improvised techniques for harmonizing Gregorian chant melodies. This improvised technique became a quasi-composed genre or set of genres that are sometimes called faux-bourdon or fa-burden, related ideas. These two terms basically mean a false bass, false in the sense of a bass that came about as a result of the contours of the original melody. But it basically is a vocal harmonization practice. So, as we said, the hotbed of musical development in the 15th century was this Franco-Flemish, Franco-Burgundian region. We're talking about northern France, Belgium, bleeding a little bit south into what was the region known as Burgundy. So there's a first generation of composers in the earlier 15th century, composers like Dufay and Binchois. A little bit later, we have composers like Ockeghem and Bunois. These are names that you'll encounter in your reading. And a little bit later, Josquin des Prés. More on him in a moment. But all these composers are coming from towns that are, an hour or so drive by car apart from one another. So a rather small region geographically. These composers took elements of the English style, as I just described, and applied them in part in their transformation of ars nova practices from the 14th century. So we'll find that genres of music come and go in the course of our broader story over the century. And one genre to emerge more clearly in the Renaissance period is the so-called cyclic mass. This means that composers, moving from composing a single or a pair of mass ordinary movements, now look to compose every movement of the ordinary in a musically unified manner. And the tools of unifying those movements of the mass are several. One way is to use a pre-existing tune like a Gregorian chant melody, or in some cases a secular tune, basically like a pop song of the day, as the basis either for points of imitation or as a structural skeleton in long notes, the so-called cantus firmus. I used that term a little bit earlier, but I should have defined it. So it's a pre-existing tune that exists generally in longer note values than the notes of the other voices, but it is a long melody around which the other voices are built. You'll recall that in the example of the Peritan organum from a week or two ago, we had a single voice in extremely long note values, around which the other voices more or less danced in this modal rhythm. Here, the contrast in length is not so extreme, but you still get that sort of general effect. An example of the use of a pre-existing melody can be found in Dufay's pair of pieces. First, his chanson, a secular song in French, in 3 parts, Sur la face épale. He took this tune and used one of the voices as the basis of his mass, or you could say missa sur la face épale. So basically that term means a mass using part of this chanson as the basis of the mass composition. So I want you to take a listen to both the chanson sur la face épale and the Kyrie from that mass and see if you can pick out which part from the chanson he used from the mass. And also listen for and see if you can describe, at least to yourself, the general melodic, harmonic, and contrapuntal language of this style. Take a moment for that. So now we're back. It's important to realize that in the setting of a Mass ordinary, one would never hear the entire Mass from beginning to end in a service. So you have these unifying ideas like a cantus firmus or points of imitation, but there's a bunch of stuff that would happen in between, either other pieces of music or the priest or other celebrants talking. So there are pauses. So these ideas from earlier parts of the service had to be recalled by the listener, even though other stuff had happened in between. But even though these pieces were broken up, it does seem to be an early example in music in the European tradition of a desire to work out larger scale musical structures. So I talked for a moment about the second generation of Franco-Flemish composers, and I think it's worth mentioning one more time the composer Ockeghem, Johannes Ockeghem, because if you are interested in musical puzzles or contrapuntal challenges, he was a composer who really seemed to set challenges for himself about how to figure out a certain compositional problem. There are pieces really worth studying if you're interested in things like that. The Missa Prolationum is an example. It's basically an interesting play on the rhythmic possibilities of the mensural system of notation, the kind of way of organizing rhythm that predates the metrical system that we deal with today. There's another mass that is called the Missa cuius vis toni, the mass on any tone, and one can sing it in different modes. It's the same set of pitches, but basically one chooses to sing it on one mode or another, like changing a tune in major to minor, and miraculously it all works out. So, a name worth knowing. The most significant composer in the generation after Ockeghem, and again from this Franco-Flemish region, is Josquin des Prés. And the authors spend a fair amount of time talking about Josquin, and I think with good reason. Josquin was, among other things, the first real international musical star in the European literate tradition. His big advantage was that the printing press for music had come into use by the beginning of the 16th century, and Josquin was active until the 1520s. So the first important printer was Petrucci in Venice. And Venice in northern Italy, was the first important center for music printing. And Petrucci's first volume of music dedicated to a single composer was Josquin's music. Music printing eventually exploded into the major urban centers in Europe. There was the printing house of Attignan in Paris and others in Venice, Germany, and so on and so forth. But in the course of the 16th century, you can see the demand and the production of printed music really exploding, which changed in a major way people's access to music for domestic consumption. Getting back to Josquin, he's credited with bringing a new level of sensitivity to text setting. But he was also a real contrapuntal craftsman, a little bit like Ockeghem. And especially in his masses, he's often fond of churning out some repetitive musical idea or little rhythmic melodic cell, an idea that gradually gets developed in some way. And in this way, that music reminds me of some of the sounds that you end up with in a style known as minimalism that developed centuries later in the 20th century, post-Second World War, into the 21st century. So if we keep Josquin in mind for a number of months, we might encounter something similar when we eventually get to the 20th century. I'd like you to take a listen to one of his motets, Ave Maria. I want you to listen for how the voices imitate one another, and also how Josquin creates some extra drama towards the end of major sections of the piece. It's a way of creating a musical punctuation that goes a little bit beyond just the simple idea of a cadence, so two voices moving, say, from a sixth to an octave, but there's a sense of heightened drama that goes a little bit beyond that. You might note that in this piece, like so many others of the period, it's based on a Gregorian melody, but it's freely embellished by the composer, such that one wouldn't necessarily directly recognize the original tune unless one knew it already. And if you have a little extra time on your hands, I would listen to Ludwig Zentfels' six-voice reworking of this motet, which you'll also find on the Naxos playlist. But in any case, be sure to listen to the Josquin right now. Okay, so sometimes this Franco-Flemish musical style spread by direct contact. And we have an important figure in the earlier 16th century, a Franco-Flemish composer named Willaert, who got a job in Venice as a chapel master. And he really was instrumental in importing this Franco-Flemish style to Italy. Interestingly, that post, the post of chapel master at St. Mark's in Venice, which is the big important church in Venice, was ultimately taken up by native Italian composers. So by that point, a little bit later in the 16th century, there were enough musicians who were versed in the style such that there wasn't so much of a need to import musicians from the north into the south. And it was certainly a trend in the 15th and 16th centuries that rich places in Italy and elsewhere in Europe who could afford it could import the best musicians from the north, from this Franco-Flemish region, to work in their courts, to serve as their chapel masters. But eventually, as the style spread, this became less necessary. You can listen now to Willaert's Benedicta S, a piece in 7 voices, so a richer texture than we've encountered so far. So let's talk a little bit about the later 16th century, where some of the most well-known composers today were active. By the later 16th century, this ars perfecta style begins to have some features that resemble what we might call tonal music. Generally triadic harmonies, although they wouldn't have thought about them in those terms. And a greater sense of harmonically driven cadences, although cadences were still technically a melodic event. So in Rome in the late 16th century, Palestrina is arguably the most significant figure, significant composer. And his works, in fact, have an unbroken performance tradition from his own time to the present day. His music was also used as a teaching tool in subsequent centuries. So if you take a class in Renaissance counterpoint at a university conservatory today, that style is to some extent modeled on Palestrina's style. Some argue that Palestrina's musical style was affected in some measure by the Counter-Reformation. So now we're getting to an external, extra musical, a bit of extra musical context. We'll talk a little bit more about what the Reformation and Counter-Reformation is, but take a listen to the Gloria from the Missa Papae Marcelli of Palestrina. You'll read in the textbook in a little bit more detail about the particular features of the historical context of what was going on in Rome at the time, the Counter-Reformation. But for now, just take a listen and think about the intelligibility of the words compared to some of the other examples you've heard. I'm not talking about being able to understand the meaning of the words in this context, but just the ability to understand the sounds and syllables of what's being uttered. So now that you've listened to that, let's talk a little bit about the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which is an historical phenomenon that is an essential part of what happened in music in the 16th century. So as you may know, in the early 16th century, there were various sorts of breaks with the Catholic Church in Europe. And some breaks were more extreme than others. Some were more practical than doctrinal. But all of them had enormous consequences for the flavors of musical style cultivated in various places, especially in sacred music. So in the case of those regions that eventually adhered to Lutheranism, the Lutheran doctrine itself wasn't terribly far removed from Catholicism, and Martin Luther himself was a pretty big fan of music. So music in services was often permitted to be still fairly ornate. Later, we'll look at the figure of J.S. Bach, who was working for much of his life in a Lutheran church context, and his even church music ended up being fairly quite complex at times. But in places that adhered to what was known as Calvinism, this was a more extreme version of Protestantism, and Calvinism forbade any polyphonic music or instruments in church services themselves. So Bach's music would have had no place in a Calvinist service. It was only unison psalm singing that was allowed, but in the vernacular language critically to some of the tenets of Protestantism. The whole idea of the congregation participating more directly in the service. But it's interesting that in Calvinist circles, some composers did write polyphony, but for domestic consumption. They used these psalm tunes in a way that is akin to the use of Gregorian melodies as a pre-existing melody, as the basis of a polyphonic composition. And then in Anglicanism, so the breaking away of the Church of England from Rome, as you may know, that had a lot to do with Henry VIII's desire to remarry. So there wasn't at least initially, a huge philosophical or doctrinal separation from Catholicism. So there again, there was a certain, for a time at least, permission of more elaborate music than one would find, say, in Calvinist circles for sure. But even in places that remained Catholic, there was a desire to hold on to the flock, so lest they run away and join the Protestant cause. And that led some to call for a simplification of complex polyphony, so that the words could be more clearly understood. And this seems to have had an effect on composition in the late Renaissance, in some circles. But there was also a trend towards greater splendor, a sort of feast for the senses, also to draw people back or to keep them in the church. And one sees this in the music, for example, of Andrea and Giovanni Gabrieli, with effects like divided choirs and the use of instruments. We'll see these trends continue to develop as we talk more about Baroque music. The international style of polyphonic composition took on a somewhat different flavor in England, but it was recognizably a cousin of the music that emerged from the Franco-Flemish region. After the Reformation came along, there were certainly effects on composition, especially in periods where there was a demand for English language music, and also especially when the tradition of choir boys that supplied the top lines of the musical texture, when that tradition went dormant for a time. So you also had changes in the range of musical compositions, things like that. But I want you to take a listen to a motet by William Byrd, one of my favorite motets from perhaps my favorite English Renaissance composer, and the English Renaissance composer many regard as the most accomplished, perhaps the most accomplished in the whole period, according to some. So take a listen to this piece, and then we'll talk a little bit about Byrd. Okay, Byrd's career in England flourished for quite a while, in spite of the fact that he remained a Catholic, even in the time when Elizabeth supported Protestantism as the state religion. England in this period and beyond Elizabeth went back and forth between Catholicism and Anglicanism. So depending on who was on the throne, different things had to happen in church services, so it was a pretty confusing time. Another composer famous in the period, a little bit older than Byrd, Thomas Tallis, lived through several changes, and you can see a clear change in his musical style depending on who he had to compose for, what kinds of services he had to compose for. But Byrd stuck to his guns a little bit more. He was even composing masses and having them published, even during the time of Protestantism. He enjoyed protection from the crown for a time, but eventually he retired to the country, where it was easier to be a practicing, albeit secret, Catholic. So that's a little bit on Byrd. So far we've focused almost exclusively on sacred music, but there was plenty of music composed in secular genres in this period. And depending on where you were in Europe, composers were composing in different languages. The composer Orlando di Lasso is worth mentioning partly because he was extremely prolific and extremely popular in his day. He published lots and lots of music. He worked in Germany for most of his career, but he composed in all sorts of vernacular genres. So songs in French, in Italian, in German, not to mention Latin, sacred compositions as well. In some cases, there was little stylistic difference between sacred and secular genres. So a polyphonic chanson might sound more or less like a polyphonic motet. But certain composers, especially in the late Renaissance, especially those influenced by the renewal of interest in the poetry of Petrarch, a 14th century Florentine poet, developed a more mannerist style of composing, a style that was more directly connected to expression of individual words or individual sentiments. And those composers composing Italian secular music, the genre they were working in was generally known as the madrigal. So I want you to listen to a couple examples of madrigals now, one by Monteverdi and one by Gesualdo. So the first is Cruda Amarilli, and the second is Moro Lasso. And part of the reason for listening to these now is that you can start to prepare mentally for the kind of listening I'm going to ask you to do for the first paper for this course. So before listening, I encourage you to look at the first paper assignment sheet on the OL. So that will pretty much cover some of the questions that I want you to be thinking about. The general idea is that you think about the kinds of sentiments being expressed musically and how those are connected to the text. How carefully, how directly that relationship is. We've seen, you could say very broadly speaking, in the course of our study of music in the European tradition so far, a closer connection on the surface level between words and music. And here, in these late 16th, and in some cases early 17th century madrigals, you see this really taken to a very specific extreme, somewhat even overdone, according to the taste of some. Not to everyone. It's not to everyone's taste, the way that these sentiments are so directly expressed sometimes. But take a listen to those two, bearing in mind some of the questions that I'm asking for that first paper, and then I have a little bit more after that. Okay, so that pretty much takes us to the end of things for today. So I'll just remind you of a few things. Let me find my notes here. Right, so again, please have, if you didn't give presentations last time, have your notes ready so that we can get to those right away and be fairly efficient in what we do before we move on to some other things. And again, we'll have those listening quizzes on the medieval and Renaissance playlists. If you look at the listening list, you'll see that some items are marked with an asterisk. Those you're not responsible for, although I'm hoping that you'll take a listen. But it's the items that are not asterisk that I'll ask you to get to know a little more intimately. And again, I'll be emailing you more information about the first online quiz, but that is going to happen fairly soon. Okay, so that is my very brief description of the Renaissance period, 200 years in about 35 minutes or so. It definitely doesn't do it justice, but we can further this conversation when we're all together again in class. If you have any questions about what I've talked about, what you're reading in the reading, what you're listening to in the listening lists, then bring those questions or email me or come to office hours. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.